He was a traitor, that guy. I don't care if they never mentioned my name. It all fell through. I'm still mad at him. They're all dead, so I'm going to be surprised.
Dick Van Dyke has always been the smiling face of Hollywood's golden age. From The Dick Van Dyke Show to Mary Poppins to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, his warmth, humor, and charm turned him into a household name. Even now, at the remarkable age of 99, audiences think of him as one of the most lovable men to ever grace a stage or screen. But behind that glowing smile lies a story few people know. Because Dick Van Dyke's career, like any other, wasn't just filled with applause, laughter, and happy endings. It was also shaped by betrayal, by rivals who left scars, by disappointments that stung far more than critics' reviews, and by friendships that fell apart when he needed them most. For decades, Van Dyke kept silent about the darker side of Hollywood. He never wanted to shatter the image of himself as a friendly, good-natured entertainer, but as he entered the later years of his life, he began speaking more openly about the people who hurt him the most. 6 names in particular stand out. 6 individuals who, for one reason or another, left him feeling anger, heartbreak, or even hatred. Some were once close friends. Others were powerful figures in the industry, and one, surprisingly, was the man he saw in the mirror every day. Before Dick Van Dyke became a legend, he was just another struggling performer trying to break into the business. Long before Broadway, Disney, and Hollywood came calling, Van Dyke's earliest professional identity was as part of a comedy duo known as the Merry Mutes. His partner was a man named Phil Erickson, a performer with equal dreams of making it big. Together, they worked tirelessly, bouncing jokes off one another, building routines, and honing their craft in small clubs and modest venues. To Dick, Phil wasn't just a partner, he was a brother in arms. They were going to conquer the entertainment world together. But in a way that would foreshadow many of Dick's later disappointments, the dream ended not with a bang, but with silence. One day, Phil simply walked away. No major fight, no dramatic confrontation, just a decision to leave the act and pursue his own path, leaving Dick blindsided and heartbroken. For Dick, it felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than words could describe. He had believed in loyalty, in shared vision, in the bond of 2 hungry young men chasing a dream. And suddenly, that bond was broken. He was left to pick up the pieces alone, to rebuild his confidence and career without the person he thought would always be at his side. In later interviews, Van Dyke admitted that Phil's sudden departure shaped the way he viewed every professional partnership that came after. It left him wary of trusting too deeply and taught him that even those who seem closest can vanish when the pressure mounts. But Phil Erickson wasn't the only early wound. As Dick began navigating Hollywood, he found himself up against a system that didn't always value him. In the early 1950s, agents dismissed him as too plain, producers told him he didn't have the looks to be a leading man, and more than once he was advised to stick to radio rather than aim for television. These rejections burned into his memory. Each one left him not just discouraged but angry, convinced that Hollywood gatekeepers thrived on crushing dreams. Dick would later admit that he carried a quiet hatred for those anonymous voices. The agents, the casting directors, the executives who told him he wasn't good enough. He didn't always remember their names, but he remembered the sting. He remembered the humiliation of sitting in offices, pitching himself, only to be dismissed in seconds. These were the people who underestimated him, and in his mind, he vowed to prove them wrong. That anger fueled him when he finally broke through. When The Dick Van Dyke Show became a smash success in the early 1960s, Dick often thought back to those early rejections, and though he smiled for the cameras, a part of him always held on to the bitterness. He never forgot the feeling of being discarded, of being told he didn't belong. Those voices became the ghosts of his career, shadows that followed him even into his greatest triumphs. By the time he reached fame, Van Dyke had already learned one of Hollywood's harshest lessons. Betrayal comes early, and it comes from the people you trust most. Whether it was a partner who abandoned him or the industry gatekeepers who wrote him off, Dick carried those wounds for decades. They became the foundation for his guarded nature and his careful smile, a smile that hid the truth, his main attractions. At first, their relationship was warm. Rose admired Dick's charm, and Dick appreciated Rose's timing and wit. But soon, things began to shift. Mary Tyler Moore, a relative newcomer, began stealing scenes with her natural talent and magnetic presence. Audiences adored Mary, and critics couldn't stop praising her. For Rose Marie, it felt like her importance on the show was shrinking, and although she never lashed out publicly, her bitterness often showed behind the curtain. According to people who worked on the set, Rose sometimes dismissed Dick's loyalty to Mary, joking that the show should have been called The Mary Tyler Moore Show years before Mary ever had one of her own. For Dick, who cared deeply about harmony on set, this tension was difficult to bear. He respected Rose Marie and had hoped for a lasting friendship, but instead, he often felt her quiet disapproval. Later in life, he admitted that the distance between them hurt him more than he let on. He didn't hate her in the loud, angry sense, but he carried resentment for the way their camaraderie dissolved into rivalry. Then there was Mary Tyler Moore herself. If Rose Marie represented a friend turned cold, Mary embodied a more complicated wound. Their on-screen marriage was one of the most beloved in television history. Together, they created a model of the ideal suburban couple, charming, funny, and effortlessly in sync. But behind the laughter, Dick's feelings for Mary were far deeper than he ever revealed at the time. He later confessed that he had quietly fallen in love with her. He adored her elegance, her wit, and the way she could light up a room without even trying. But those feelings remained unspoken, complicated by their professional relationship and the fact that both were married during much of their time on the show. Instead of confessing his love, Dick buried it, and that silence turned into a private form of hatred, not for Mary herself, but for the situation, for the reality that he could never have her. He once admitted that the show's success was bittersweet. Every day he worked with Mary was a joy, but every day was also a reminder of what could never be. The love he felt for her was a secret that turned into regret, and regret into bitterness. For Dick, Mary became not just a partner, but a ghost of the life he might have lived if circumstances had been different. That lingering ache, that unspoken sorrow, stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The rivalries of television didn't stop with Mary and Rose. Van Dyke also faced professional jealousy from other actors and comedians who believed his success had come too easily. He recalled moments when peers would downplay his talent, suggesting he was just a lucky face at the right place and time. For someone who had fought tooth and nail through years of rejection, those accusations cut deep. In Hollywood, laughter was currency, and every star fought to hold the spotlight. For Dick, the rivalries he endured during the Dick Van Dyke Show years taught him another painful truth. Sometimes the people you work closest with become the ones who wound you most. Rose Marie's fading friendship, Mary's unattainable love, and the whispers of jealous peers, these were scars that no amount of applause could heal. By the late 1960s, Dick Van Dyke had become more than just a television star. He was a bona fide Hollywood figure. His work with Disney and Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang brought him international fame, especially among families who saw him as the epitome of light-hearted joy. To the public, he was unstoppable. But for Dick himself, this period carried some of his deepest disappointments, as the very idols he admired and worked alongside revealed sides of themselves that left him bitter and disillusioned. The most striking example was Walt Disney himself. For Van Dyke, working with Disney was like stepping into a dream. Walt represented imagination, magic, and the kind of family entertainment Dick believed in with all his heart. When he was cast as Bert in Mary, Poppins Van Dyke thought he had found not just a boss, but a kindred spirit. Yet as magical as the production appeared on screen, behind the scenes, Van Dyke discovered just how ruthless Disney could be. It wasn't Walt personally who dealt the most painful blow, but the Disney organization itself. When the film was being prepared for release, Dick learned that his Cockney accent, widely mocked by critics and audiences alike, had been allowed to go forward without any coaching or adjustment. He had begged for a dialect coach, and Disney executives brushed him off. They didn't think it mattered. Later, when reviewers panned him for what became one of the worst accents in film history, Dick felt betrayed. To him, Disney had sacrificed his dignity for the sake of cost and convenience. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a professional wound that haunted him for decades, and yet Walt Disney himself didn't shield him from the criticism. In interviews after the film's release, Dick recalled Walt laughing it off as though the whole thing were nothing but a minor blemish. To Van Dyke, it wasn't minor. It was his reputation, his craft, and his pride. He adored Walt Disney, the man, but he quietly hated the way the company treated him. As a replaceable performer, not as a true partner in the creative process, that resentment became a permanent shadow on what should have been one of the happiest collaborations of his life. Another disappointment came in the form of Hollywood's critical establishment. For years, Dick idolized great comedians like Jerry Lewis, Red Skelton, and others, who defined mid-century humor. He wanted their approval, hoped to be seen as their equal. But instead of mentorship, what he received was dismissal. Several comedy veterans criticized his style as too safe, too soft, or too dependent on charm. One critic cruelly called him a song and dance man lost in a comedian's body. This hurt Dick deeply because comedy was not just his profession, it was his identity. To be dismissed by the very men he looked up to was like being rejected by family. He spoke later in life about how Jerry Lewis, in particular, left him cold. Lewis was a genius in his own right, but he was also famously arrogant. Dick tried to befriend him, tried to learn from him, but Lewis treated him with condescension. For Van Dyke, who had grown up idolizing performers of Lewis's stature, the rejection felt like betrayal. He didn't lash out publicly, but privately. He added Lewis's name to the mental list of people who had wounded him. And then there was the Hollywood machine itself, the producers, executives, and financiers who didn't care about art, only about money. In the 1970s, when Van Dyke wanted to transition into more serious acting roles, he faced brick walls. Studios told him audiences wouldn't accept him in dramatic parts. Casting directors insisted he was trapped by his nice guy image. Van Dyke hated the way the system boxed him in, reducing him to a caricature of himself. For a man who longed to show the world his range, those limitations felt like chains. Over time, Dick realized that some of the very people he had once revered, Disney, Lewis, the powerful studio figures, were not the friends he imagined, but obstacles to his growth. He didn't hate them with open venom, but he carried a smoldering bitterness that never quite went out. They had disappointed him not just professionally, but personally. They had shown him that Hollywood, for all its magic, was built on ruthless compromises. For the smiling, dancing man America adored, these disillusionments became a private burden. He had learned that even idols could fall from their pedestals, and that sometimes the people you admire most leave you with the deepest scars. As Dick Van Dyke approached his twilight years, interviews began to take on a more candid tone. He was no longer the young man desperate to protect his reputation or the middle-aged star worried about the Hollywood press. At 99, he had nothing left to prove. And so, for the first time, he began speaking openly about the people who had left the deepest marks on his long life. Not everyone made the list. But 6 names in one way or another stood out as the ones he could never forgive. The first was Phil Erickson, his early comedy partner, the man who abandoned him when they were struggling to break through. That quiet betrayal haunted him forever. Erickson didn't just walk away from an act, he walked away from a friendship. To Dick, it was the kind of wound you never forget. The second was Rose Marie, his co-star from the Dick Van Dyke Show. While the public adored the on-screen chemistry, behind the scenes their relationship soured. Dick carried resentment toward the way camaraderie dissolved into jealousy and rivalry, leaving him with a sense of loss that was never repaired. The third was Mary Tyler Moore, the woman he adored but could never have. To include her on such a list might seem cruel, but Dick admitted his feelings for Mary were complicated. He loved her deeply, but he also hated the ache of knowing their connection would never cross into reality. For him, that frustration was a wound that lasted a lifetime. The fourth was Walt Disney, or more accurately, the Disney organization itself. While he admired Walt as a visionary, Van Dyke never forgave the studio for letting his infamous accent in Mary Poppins go unchecked, then leaving him to bear the brunt of public ridicule. What should have been one of his proudest moments became a source of embarrassment that trailed him for decades. He never stopped feeling that the studio sacrificed him for convenience. The fifth was Jerry Lewis, the comedy legend who embodied everything Van Dyke once idolized, but who treated him with condescension and dismissiveness. Dick never forgot the sting of being brushed aside by someone he admired. It wasn't just professional, it was personal, the kind of wound that comes when your hero refuses to see you as an equal. And finally, the sixth was perhaps the most surprising of all, himself. Van Dyke admitted on more than one occasion that his greatest enemy was not a rival or an executive, but his own struggles with alcoholism and self-doubt. For years, he drank heavily, sabotaging his career and his personal relationships. He hated himself for the times he hurt loved ones, for the opportunities he wasted, and for the nights lost to addiction. Even as he found recovery later in life, he acknowledged that self-loathing was a shadow that never fully lifted. "I think," he once said, "I've always been angrier at myself than at anyone else." This final admission was perhaps the most powerful of all. It showed that Dick Van Dyke's list of grudges wasn't just about outside forces. It was also about the man inside the mirror. His smile, so beloved by audiences, often hid a storm of guilt, regret, and anger that only he could feel. By naming these 6, Phil Erickson, Rose Marie, Mary Tyler Moore, Walt Disney's studio, Jerry Lewis, and himself, Van Dyke gave fans a rare glimpse into the struggles that shaped him. He wasn't bitter in the traditional sense. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he carry hatred in the way tabloids might sensationalize. Instead, his confessions revealed a quieter truth. Even the happiest, most joyful performers are still human. They feel betrayal, they feel jealousy, they feel heartbreak. And yet, there was something remarkable in the way Van Dyke carried these grudges. He never let them harden into cruelty. He never lashed out or sought to tear others down. Instead, he used those wounds to fuel his performances, to make his comedy sharper, his songs sweeter, and his presence warmer. In many ways, the people he hated became the reason he was able to bring so much joy to others. As he stood on the edge of a century of life, Van Dyke's reckoning was less about bitterness and more about honesty. For the first time, he allowed the world to see not just the smile, but the scars behind it. And in doing so, he reminded us that legends are not defined by perfection, but by the battles they fight, both with others and with themselves.